Boston, 2025. Rain tapped steadily against the windows of Children's Hospital as curator Olivia Reeves carefully unfolded acid-free tissue paper from around a forgotten collection of photographs. The hospital's upcoming 150th anniversary had prompted an exhaustive review of historical materials, bringing to light boxes of archival photographs untouched for decades. Olivia's trained eye scanned each sepia-toned image methodically. Groups of stern-faced physicians, nurses in starched uniforms, hospital wards filled with iron beds. But one portrait stopped her cold. A young nurse, perhaps 25, sat perfectly composed in a wooden chair, her expression serene and professional. In her arms, she cradled an infant, swaddled in an intricately embroidered christening gown. The baby's face was peaceful, eyes closed as if sleeping. The back of the photograph bore an elegant inscription, Margaret Howard, head nurse, children's ward, with baby Elizabeth Stone, April 18th, 1904. Something about the image nagged at Olivia. The nurse's composure seemed too perfect, the baby too still. She retrieved her magnifying glass, studying the infant's face more closely. The child's complexion had an unmistakable waxy quality, the features slightly too rigid, the positioning of the tiny hands too symmetrical. Dr. Bennett, she called to the hospital's historical committee chairman, who was examining documents nearby. Could you look at this, please? Dr. James Bennett adjusted his glasses and examined the photograph. After a moment, he nodded soberly. Postmortem photograph? The baby had already passed. But why is the nurse holding her, not the family? Olivia asked. That's what makes this unusual, Bennett replied. Typically, deceased children were photographed with parents. A nurse posing with a deceased patient suggests something different, perhaps documentation of hospital practices, or maybe a deeper connection between nurse and patient. The inscription might give us clues. Olivia carefully placed the photograph in a protective sleeve, her mind already forming questions. Who was baby Elizabeth Stone? What was her story? And why, in death, was she photographed not with grieving parents, but with the serene-faced nurse who had cared for her? Olivia's search for information about Nurse Margaret Howard and baby Elizabeth led her to the hospital's oldest records, stored in the climate-controlled basement archives. Personnel files from 1904 revealed that Margaret Howard had been head nurse of the children's ward from 1901 until 1927, respected for her exceptional skill with critically ill infants. But the true treasure came when Olivia discovered that the hospital had preserved a collection of journals donated by Howard's niece after her death in 1952. The leather-bound volume from 1904 contained meticulous handwritten entries in precise, sloping penmanship. Margaret's journal entries painted a vivid picture of hospital life in the early 1900s. Long hours, primitive conditions, and the constant battle against infectious diseases that claimed so many young lives. Then, on March 12, 1904, Olivia found the first mention of Elizabeth Stone, baby girl brought in today, abandoned at church steps, severely malnourished, showing signs of respiratory distress. Perhaps 6 months old. No identification except a small silver cross on a ribbon around her neck and the name Elizabeth embroidered on her tattered blanket. We've given her the name Stone, as she was found near the stone baptismal font. Prognosis uncertain. Over subsequent entries, Margaret documented her growing attachment to the abandoned infant. March 20th. Elizabeth shows slight improvement. Her tiny hand grasped my finger today and would not let go for nearly an hour. Dr. Prentice says I shouldn't become attached. But how can one not respond to such a determined little soul? March 27th. Elizabeth's breathing has worsened. I've taken to spending nights in the chair beside her crib. The other nurses say I'm being unprofessional, but I cannot bear the thought of her struggling alone in the darkness. The entry for April 17th brought tears to Olivia's eyes. We lost our Elizabeth today at 3:17 this morning. I was holding her when she took her final breath, so gently it was like watching a candle flame flicker out. No family has come forward despite our notices in the papers. Tomorrow, hospital protocol dictates she be photographed for medical records before burial in the city cemetery. I have requested to hold her for this photograph. Dr. Prentice has agreed, understanding that in these 6 weeks, I became the only mother Elizabeth ever knew. Olivia sat back, the journal open in her lap, the photograph beside it. What had initially appeared to be a simple hospital documentation now revealed itself as something far more poignant, a nurse's act of love, ensuring that in death, as in the final weeks of her life, the abandoned infant would be held in caring arms. To better understand the photograph's context, Olivia consulted Dr. Eleanor Fisher, a medical historian specializing in early children's health care. They met in the hospital's library, the 1904 photograph between them on the polished oak table. Post-mortem photography was common practice well into the early 20th century, Dr. Fisher explained, examining the image through archival gloves. But this example is particularly interesting because it represents an institutional rather than family memorial. Would it have been unusual for a nurse to pose with a deceased patient? Olivia asked. Quite unusual, Fisher confirmed. Postmortem photographs typically served family remembrance, parents with deceased children, siblings together, family groups. They were deeply personal mementos in an era when infant mortality was devastatingly common. The fact that Nurse Howard posed with Elizabeth suggests this was not merely clinical documentation. Fisher opened a portfolio containing examples of early memorial photography. Notice the differences in approach. Family photographs often tried to create the illusion of life, positioning children as if sleeping, sometimes with toys or favorite possessions. This institutional photograph is more formal but still conveys tremendous dignity and care. Margaret's journal indicates she had become deeply attached to Elizabeth. Olivia noted. Fisher nodded. Well, that explains the unique nature of this image. It bridges the professional and personal realms in a way rarely documented. For abandoned children, hospital staff sometimes form profound attachments, essentially becoming surrogate family. Fisher pointed out subtle details in the photograph. The quality of Elizabeth's christening gown, far finer than standard hospital garments. The small silver cross, visible at the infant's neck. The way Margaret cradled the baby with practiced tenderness rather than formal stiffness. Margaret dressed her in special clothing for this photograph, Fisher observed. That christening gown would not have been hospital property. She likely purchased or made it herself, wanting Elizabeth to have the dignity of proper burial clothes. Her journal mentions the silver cross was found with Elizabeth, Olivia said. A significant detail, Fisher replied. In that era, such items left with abandoned infants often indicated a parent who couldn't keep their child but wanted them to have something of value, both monetary and spiritual. The cross suggests Elizabeth's birth mother wanted her to be recognized as someone's beloved child, even in abandonment. As they concluded their meeting, Fisher offered a final observation. What makes this photograph remarkable is not just its documentation of historical practices, but how it captures an essential human truth that transcends time, that the bond between caregiver and child can form quickly, deeply, and permanently, even in the most tragic circumstances. Olivia's next step was to search for medical records that might shed light on Elizabeth Stone's brief life and the circumstances of her care. Hospital patient records from 1904 were fragmentary, with many lost in a storage fire in the 1930s, but the Children's Ward admission ledger had survived. The entry for Elizabeth was brief but informative. Infant female, approximately 6 months, admitted March 12, 1904. Diagnosis, severe malnourishment, respiratory infection, suspected tuberculosis. Guardian, State Orphanage Authority. Attending physician, Dr. Walter Prentice. Primary nurse, Margaret Howard. Tracking down Elizabeth's death certificate required a visit to the city archives. The document, filed under Stone Elizabeth Infant, listed the cause of death as consumption and failure to thrive. No parents were named, simply unknown, written in faded ink. The informant was listed as Margaret Howard, head nurse, and the burial location as City Cemetery, Section 8, Infants. Dr. Bennett helped Olivia interpret the medical terminology through a modern lens. What they called consumption was likely pulmonary tuberculosis, extremely common and deadly in that era, particularly for malnourished infants. Without antibiotics, there was little they could do beyond palliative care. The most illuminating document came from Dr. Prentice's monthly report to the hospital board, preserved in the administrative archives. We continue to see abandoned infants at an alarming rate, many showing signs of severe neglect. Of particular note is the case of baby Elizabeth Stone, admitted in March and deceased in April. This case demonstrates both the limitations of our medical capabilities and the exemplary dedication of our nursing staff. Head nurse Howard provided extraordinary care, remaining with the infant during off-duty hours and ensuring dignified treatment through final disposition. While I have cautioned staff against forming personal attachments to patients, I cannot fault the quality of care this dedication produced. The infant's memorial photograph has been preserved in our records as an example of professional compassion in terminal cases. A notation in the hospital's financial ledger revealed a small but significant detail. April 19th, 1904. Disbursement to M. Howard for reimbursement of burial expenses for indigent patient E. Stone, $475. This sum, considerable for a nurse's salary in 1904, suggested Margaret had personally funded a burial beyond the simple interment provided by the city for unclaimed infants. Olivia pieced together these fragments to form a clearer picture. An abandoned infant, gravely ill, had formed the center of an improvised circle of care, with Nurse Margaret Howard assuming a role that went beyond professional duty into personal devotion. The photograph was not merely a clinical record, but a testament to this relationship, a memorial created by someone determined that Elizabeth's short life and death would be witnessed and remembered with dignity. Through persistent research, Olivia located the name of the hospital's contracted photographer from 1900-1910, James Sullivan. While Sullivan himself had died in 1936, his business records and notes had been preserved by the Boston Historical Photography Society. Sullivan's appointment book for April 18, 1904, contained a brief entry. Children's Hospital, 10 a.m. Memorial portrait, deceased infant with Nurse Howard. Special considerations noted. More revealing were Sullivan's technical notes, where he recorded specific approaches for different types of photography. In a section titled Memorial Portraits, he had written, "Hospital memorials require particular sensitivity, especially with infant subjects. For the stone infant, April 18th, Nurse Howard requested specific accommodations, natural light only, no visible support apparatus for positioning, and the child to be photographed in her arms rather than in the standard repose position. This required longer exposure time due to reduced flash powder usage, necessitating exceptional stillness from Nurse Howard. The nurse provided special white christening clothes and insisted on washing and preparing the infant herself rather than allowing mortuary preparation. She also requested copies of the photograph for hospital records and for herself personally, unusual for an institutional subject, but granted, given the circumstances, no family to claim. Infant. Note for future institutional memorials. The tenderness evident in Nurse Howard's approach produced a superior result to the standard clinical documentation. Consider suggesting similar approaches for other hospital memorial photographs, where appropriate." Sullivan had also preserved his correspondence with the hospital, including a note from Dr. Prentice authorizing payment for 2 copies of the photograph, one for official records and one for Nurse Howard's personal keeping. A subsequent letter from Margaret herself thanked Sullivan for his dignified and gentle handling of our Elizabeth's memorial portrait. The photographer's records confirmed what Olivia had begun to suspect, that this photograph represented a deliberate effort by Margaret to ensure that Elizabeth received in death the kind of loving attention most children receive from parents. The portrait was both documentary and deeply personal, an act of care extending beyond the child's life. Sullivan's final note about the session revealed his own emotional response. "Of the many post-mortem photographs I have been called to take, this stands among the most affecting. The nurse held this child not with the formal pose of professional duty, but with the same tender attention I observed when my own wife held our sleeping daughter. Some bonds transcend the expected relationships, reminding us that family is sometimes found rather than born." Olivia carefully documented these findings, increasingly moved by the story emerging around what had initially seemed a simply unsettling historical photograph. The portrait was revealing itself as the visible evidence of a profound human connection formed in the most difficult circumstances between an abandoned child and the nurse who had become her surrogate mother. Margaret's journal had mentioned a silver cross found with baby Elizabeth when she was abandoned. Olivia wondered if this artifact might still exist somewhere in the hospital's collections. Her search led her to the small museum maintained in the hospital's administrative building, which preserved significant items from throughout the institution's history. The museum's curator, Dr. Sarah Chen, was initially skeptical. "Small personal items from patients rarely survived, especially from indigent cases," she explained. "However, we do have a collection donated by Margaret Howard's family after her death. Let me check the inventory." To both women's surprise, the Howard collection included a small velvet box containing a tarnished silver cross on a faded ribbon. The accompanying note card, written in Margaret's hand, read simply, "Elizabeth Stone's cross, found with her at abandonment, March 1904, kept in her memory." The cross was delicately crafted, featuring an engraved floral pattern around the edges. Though tarnished with age, it was clearly of good quality. Not an expensive piece of jewelry, but neither was it a cheap trinket. When Dr. Chen carefully turned it over, they discovered a tiny engraving on the back, "With love, always." "This adds another dimension to Elizabeth's story," Olivia observed. "Someone cared enough to leave this with her when they felt forced to give her up." The early 1900s offered few options for single mothers or impoverished families, Dr. Chen noted. Leaving a child at a church with a valuable item often indicated desperate circumstances rather than lack of love, Margaret's journal entries. Following Elizabeth's death revealed how the cross had become a tangible connection to the infant she had cared for. April 30th, 1904. "I wear Elizabeth's silver cross inside my uniform while on duty. It feels important to carry this small piece of her with me as I care for other children. Dr. Prentice says I should consider returning to regular duties rather than remaining exclusively in the terminal ward, but I find comfort in being with the children who need the most presence. May 15th, 1904. Visited Elizabeth's grave today. The small marker shows only her name and dates, but I know who she was, how she fought to breathe, how she gripped my finger, how her eyes would follow my movements. I placed wildflowers on the grave and promised to return. Her cross hangs now beside my bed when I'm not wearing it." The journal revealed that Margaret had continued visiting Elizabeth's grave monthly for years. Even more moving, she had established a small fund to provide proper burial clothes for other abandoned infants who died in the hospital's care. She transformed her grief into a mission, Dr. Chen observed as they carefully returned the cross to its protective box. This wasn't just about one child she became attached to. Elizabeth's death changed how Margaret approached her entire nursing career. The silver cross, kept carefully for nearly 50 years until Margaret's own death, stood as tangible evidence of a bond that had transcended professional boundaries. And even death itself, a nurse who had refused to let an abandoned child pass unmourned and unremembered, armed with the information from Elizabeth's death certificate. Olivia visited the old city cemetery where the infant had been buried. Section 8, the children's section, was located in a quiet corner beneath ancient oak trees. Most of the graves from the early 1900s had simple markers, many weathered beyond legibility. The cemetery office provided maps of the historical sections. The attendant, an older man named Joseph, who had worked there for decades, became interested in Olivia's research. The children's section from that era has a story not many know, he explained. Most abandoned or indigent children received only numbered markers, if anything. But there was a nurse from Children's Hospital who changed that for many of them. Joseph led Olivia through rows of small markers until they reached a modest stone that read, Elizabeth Stone, unknown in life, beloved in death, 1903-1904. Unlike many surrounding graves, this one showed signs of care. The stone was relatively well preserved, the small plot free of encroaching weeds. The records show this plot was purchased privately rather than through the city indigent fund, Joseph explained. And something unusual, there's a perpetual care notation in the records, with a small endowment established in 1952. 1952? That's the year Margaret Howard died, Olivia realized. She must have arranged for Elizabeth's grave to be maintained after her death. Joseph nodded. The original notation says, Margaret Howard, nurse, as the purchaser. And the records show she did the same for several other children's graves in this section between 1904 and 1927. Examining the surrounding plots, Olivia noticed several with similar markers, simple but dignified stones for children identified only by first names and approximate dates. Cemetery records confirmed that Margaret had purchased individual markers for over 20 children during her nursing career, all patients who had died without family to claim them. Most moving was a discovery Joseph made while reviewing the oldest cemetery ledgers. According to this, when Nurse Howard died in 1952, her will specified that she wished to be buried in the children's section, near Elizabeth Stone, rather than in her family plot. He pointed to a modest grave about 10 feet from Elizabeth's, marked Margaret Howard, 1879-1952, faithful nurse and guardian. She chose to be buried near the children she cared for rather than with her own family, Olivia said softly. It happens more than you might think, Joseph replied. People form bonds that go beyond conventional relationships. In 50 years working here, I've seen how death sometimes reveals the true architecture of human connections, who really mattered to whom. Before leaving, Olivia placed flowers on both graves, capturing a photograph of the two stones, the nurse and the infant she had refused to let be forgotten. Their final resting places, a permanent testament to a bond that had begun in a hospital ward and continued long after. Death had separated them. As Olivia prepared materials for the hospital's anniversary exhibition, the inclusion of the 1904 photograph became a point of contention among the planning committee. Some members raised concerns about displaying post-mortem photography to modern audiences unaccustomed to such images. This could be disturbing to visitors, argued Dr. Paul Winters, the committee chairman. Most people today have never seen post-mortem photography and might find it morbid or upsetting. But that's precisely why it's valuable, Olivia countered. This photograph documents not just medical history, but changing cultural approaches to death, grief, and professional boundaries. Margaret Howard's story offers insights into both historical nursing practice and timeless human compassion. Dr. Bennett, who had supported Olivia's research from the beginning, added another perspective. We do the public a disservice if we sanitize medical history. Infant mortality was a daily reality in 1904. Understanding how healthcare providers navigated those losses helps us appreciate both medical progress and the emotional dimensions of historical care. The debate expanded to include ethical considerations of displaying images of deceased patients, even those from over a century ago. The hospital's ethics consultant, Dr. Maya Singh, provided guidance. The key factors here are dignity, educational value, and appropriate context. This isn't sensationalism. It's a carefully researched historical narrative that honors both the nurse and the infant. After weeks of discussion, a compromise was reached. The exhibition would include the photograph with comprehensive contextual information, thoughtful framing about historical memorial practices, and clear advance notices allowing visitors to choose whether to view this section. Most importantly, the focus would be not on death itself, but on Margaret's extraordinary dedication and the bonds that formed between healthcare providers and their most vulnerable patients. Olivia worked carefully on the exhibition text, ensuring it captured the full humanity of both Margaret and Elizabeth. This 1904 portrait initially appears to show simply a nurse holding a sleeping infant. Closer examination reveals it as a post-mortem photograph, a common memorial practice in an era of high infant mortality. Nurse Margaret Howard holds baby Elizabeth Stone, an abandoned infant she cared for during the 6 weeks before the child succumbed to tuberculosis. Unlike typical post-mortem photographs taken with family members, this image represents a bond formed within hospital walls. Margaret became Elizabeth's surrogate mother, staying with her through nights of labored breathing, purchasing special burial clothes, and ensuring the abandoned child received the same dignified remembrance as any beloved infant. The photograph invites us to consider how caregivers in the past navigated professional duties and personal attachments, and how institutions acknowledged the humanity of even their most vulnerable patients. Margaret's decision to be photographed with Elizabeth transformed what could have been merely clinical documentation into an act of love, ensuring that in death, as in her final weeks of life, this child would be held in caring arms. As the exhibition took shape, Olivia realized the photograph had become much more than a curious historical artifact. It stood as a powerful reminder that even in clinical settings, even across the boundary of death, human connection remains the foundation of true caregiving. While researching Margaret Howard's later career, Olivia discovered that Elizabeth's death had profoundly influenced Margaret's approach to nursing. Hospital records showed that after 1904, Margaret had requested permanent assignment to the terminal care ward, where she specialized in caring for children with little chance of recovery. Dr. Prentice's annual reviews documented both his professional respect and occasional concern. Nurse Howard demonstrates exceptional skill in providing comfort to terminal patients. Her ability to remain present with dying children brings immeasurable comfort to those in her care. I have observed, however, her tendency to form deep attachments to patients, which raises concerns for her own emotional well-being. Despite these concerns, Margaret's approach proved influential. Training materials from 1915 included her written guidelines for terminal pediatric care, emphasizing both technical protocols and emotional support. When medical intervention can no longer save a child's life, our duty transforms from curing to caring. This means meticulous attention to physical comfort, but equally important is emotional presence. No child should die feeling abandoned or alone. The nurse must balance professional composure with genuine compassion, recognizing that these final human connections matter profoundly, both to the dying child and to those who remain. Most revealing were letters from parents whose children had died under Margaret's care. One mother wrote in 1921, "When our Sarah's illness proved fatal, we were too overcome with grief to remain constantly at her bedside. Knowing Nurse Howard was with her, speaking softly and holding her hand through those final hours, has brought us immeasurable peace. She helped our daughter depart this world feeling beloved, and helped us bear the unbearable." Olivia arranged to interview several elderly retired nurses who had trained under Margaret in the 1940s. One 97-year-old former nurse, Clara Wilson, shared vivid memories. "Miss Howard taught us that presence was as important as procedure. She always wore a small silver cross inside her uniform. We all knew the story of baby Elizabeth, and how that experience had shaped her nursing philosophy. She would tell new nurses, remember that each child is someone's Elizabeth, whether that someone is present or not." The interviews revealed that Margaret had become something of a legend within the hospital, a demanding supervisor who insisted on technical excellence, but was equally adamant about compassionate care. She had established protocols for supporting families through children's deaths and created a memorial program that ensured no child, even those without families, would be buried without ceremony and remembrance. "Miss Howard changed how we approached terminal pediatric care," Claire explained. Before her, the focus was primarily on medical intervention until the end, with emotional support considered secondary. She insisted that when cure became impossible, how we helped children and families navigate death was equally important medical care. By the time Margaret retired in 1947, her approaches had become standardized. Practices in the hospital's terminal care unit, approaches that foreshadowed modern palliative and hospice care philosophies, decades before they became formally recognized medical specialties. On the opening night of the hospital's 150th anniversary exhibition, Olivia stood beside the carefully mounted display featuring the 1904 photograph. The image was presented in a specially designed case with subdued lighting, surrounded by Margaret's journal entries, the silver cross in its velvet box, and photographs of both Elizabeth's and Margaret's gravestones. The exhibition had drawn an unexpected crowd, including not just medical professionals, but members of the public interested in the hospital's history. Most poignant was the presence of current NICU nurses who had come specifically to see Margaret and Elizabeth's story. Her approaches weren't so different from what we consider best. "Practices today," observed Susan Torres, a veteran NICU nurse examining Margaret's care protocols. "The medical technology has transformed completely, but the essential humanity of caring for vulnerable infants and supporting families through impossible decisions that transcends time." The most unexpected visitor was an elderly woman who introduced herself as Patricia Howard Collins, Margaret Howard's great niece. Now in her 80s, she had brought additional family materials after hearing about the exhibition. Aunt Margaret never married or had children of her own, Patricia explained, but she always told us her children were the ones she cared for at the hospital. This photograph hung in her bedroom until her death. As a child, I asked her once who the baby was, and she said simply, "That's Elizabeth. She taught me what it means to be a nurse." Patricia donated additional items to the hospital archives, letters Margaret had written to her sister describing her work. A small book of poems Margaret had composed about children in her care, and most touchingly, a hand-embroidered handkerchief with the initial E that Margaret had created in Elizabeth's memory. As Olivia guided visitors through the exhibition, she noticed how people lingered at this display longer than others, often returning for a second look. The photograph that initially appeared disturbing to modern sensibilities had, with context, transformed into something profoundly moving, evidence of human connection transcending conventional boundaries. Dr. Bennett joined Olivia as the evening concluded. "You've done something remarkable here," he observed. "This could have been presented simply as a curious historical practice, post-mortem photography in a medical setting. Instead, you've revealed the human story behind the image." "That's what struck me from the beginning," Olivia replied. "Now, this photograph isn't about death, it's about care that continued beyond death." Margaret refused to let Elizabeth be just another anonymous statistic. She insisted on her humanity, her individuality, her right to be held and remembered, and in doing so, created a legacy that shaped a century of pediatric care, Bennett added. As the exhibition lights dimmed, Olivia took a final look at the photograph, the serene-faced nurse and the still infant in her arms. What had initially seemed unsettling now appeared as a powerful testament to the deepest purpose of medicine, not merely treating conditions, but honoring the full humanity of each patient, recognizing that technical care without compassion fulfills only half of healing's potential. The 1904 portrait had become not just a historical artifact, but a reminder that in every era, the most meaningful caregiving transcends professional duty to reach the realm of genuine human connection, even across the boundary of death itself.